Okay, so welcome you all to the CMB Bharat Cosmology Seminar Series. So this is the third talk in the series. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Blake Sherwin as our seminar speaker from Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, University of Cambridge. So Professor Blake obtained his PhD from Princeton University in 2013. After that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and the University of Cambridge. Then he became an assistant professor at Cambridge in 2017, and he has been awarded several honorable awards and fellowships such as Miller Research Fellowship, NASA Einstein Fellowship, STFC Ernest Rutherford Fellowship, and many more. So he is part of several international CMB experiments such as Atacama Cosmology Telescope, Simon's Observatory, Lightbird, and CMB Stage 4. So today we will talk about do we understand the cosmic structure growth insight from new CMB lensing measurements with the Atacama Cosmology Telescope. Over to you, Blake. So it is roughly 1 hour total, including the questions. So like 45
Great.
minutes, 50 minutes talk, and then questions. Yeah, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here and for the kind introduction. So as you heard, I'm going to be talking today about what I think is a very important question, namely, do we understand the growth of cosmic structure? And I will discuss what we can learn about this question from new CMB lensing measurements with the Atacama Cosmology Telescope. So this talk will broadly divide into 3 sections. After a brief introduction, I will discuss our ACT CMB lensing measurements and what they mean for the growth of cosmic structure and cosmology. And in the last part of my talk, I'll discuss cross correlations and what they can tell us about low redshift structure growth. Let me start off, though, with an introduction to this area of research in general. So I'm sure everyone here on this call knows that, even though we've seen an enormous amount of visible matter, all of the stars and galaxies and gas make up less than 20% of the mass, and more than 80% of the mass in our universe is made up of invisible dark matter, which, based on simulations and measurements, we know is not uniformly distributed, but forms a filamentary large-scale cosmic structure that kind of underlies the distribution of galaxies. We also now have a very good understanding of how these sort of large-scale cosmic structures, which are mostly dark matter, form. The idea is that cosmic structure grows from small initial density perturbations via gravitational collapse into the structures that we see today. Now, the interesting thing about this is that how these structures grow as a function of time is very sensitive to the composition of the universe, to our theory of gravity, to the properties of the perturbations. And so we can use the growth of structure over time as a very powerful way to probe new physics and test our standard cosmological model. And so this is why we would like to be able to map out the distribution of mass and dark matter using gravitational lensing, because how the mass is distributed, and in particular how large the fluctuations in the mass distribution are, contains sort of clean information about some of the key questions in cosmology. And these include, for example, what are the properties of dark energy and dark matter? What are the masses of neutrinos? And, is GR the correct theory of gravity? If we want to make this a bit more quantitative, we can characterize the size of the fluctuations, how large they've grown to be in the mass, with a sort of parameter, sigma 8, which tells you the amplitude of density fluctuations, or to be more precise, the root mean square density fluctuation after you smooth the mass distribution in 8 megaparsec spheres. All right, so let's just say we have measurements of the mass distribution, and we would like to use these measurements of the mass distribution to look for some new physics, learn about new physics. Well, there's sort of 2 ways you can proceed. On the one hand, you can come up with a particular model. Say I have some new form of dark energy, and I have some parameterization of this, and I would like to constrain this particular model. But we can also proceed in a more kind of general agnostic way to look for new physics and test our cosmological model. And one of the most powerful sort of general tests of our standard cosmological model is to sort of check whether large-scale structure grows as our standard cosmology predicts in the following way. So first, we fit a standard lambda CDM model to CMB power spectra coming mostly from CDM model to CMB power spectra coming mostly from redshift 1100. And then we predict, assuming lambda CDM, how structure grows all the way down to redshift 0. And in particular, we predict a value for sigma 8. And then we can compare this predicted value for sigma 8 with a direct measurement of sigma 8, which we get, directly at low redshift from lensing. And we can compare these two in order to test our cosmological model. So this is generally a very powerful, consistency test of our standard model, and we want to do this at increasing precision going forward no matter what. But in recent years, as I'm sure you know, there's been more interest than usual in doing this kind of test because there are hints that something might be going wrong. And this has become known as the sort of S8 or sigma 8 tension. So just to be clear, S8 is closely related to sigma 8, the sort of clumpiness of the universe. It's just sigma 8 times omega matter over 0.3 to the power 0.5. That's what lensing constrains best. So this plot really illustrates this S8 tension. The tension is between, on the one hand, the predicted values of S8, which are shown here in green, which come from early universe fits and assume lambda CDM structure growth. And on the other hand, with this, the direct low redshift measurements of S8, which come from galaxy surveys, mostly galaxy lensing. You can see them here in blue. Now, of course, if we just had one of these measurements, these are all just low at the kind of 2 or 3 sigma level. If we had one of these measurements, I think no one would really care that much about it. But it is intriguing. And even though these are not all independent measurements, there are several different experiments that all seem to be coming in low at the kind of 2 to 3 sigma level. So what is going on here? Right? Is this just a series of unlucky fluctuations? Are these signs of systematics and one or many of these probes that have been missed? Or, the most interesting scenario would be that this is a first sign of new physics. So in this talk, I'll focus on how CMB lensing can help clarify the situation. Just a note, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the middle of the talk, and I'm happy to be interrupted. All right, so let me now introduce CMB lensing for those of you who don't know lots about it. So the CMB is kind of a unique source for the study of gravitational lensing. And I'm sure you're familiar with these sort of images of the CMB temperature fluctuations. Now, the CMB has, several things that make it unique and nice. One aspect of the CMB that makes it a nice source for studying lensing is that we just understand the CMB really well. We know exactly what redshift the CMB is emitted from. We understand the properties of the linear CMB fluctuations extremely well. So that's really nice. Another nice aspect about the CMB is that it's, the oldest light we can see. So it's therefore the most distant source of light that we can measure. And it really lies behind basically all the mass in the observable universe. So, okay, what happens as the CMB photons then travel through the universe to our telescopes? Well, as you might expect, they're gravitationally lensed or deflected by the entire large-scale mass and dark matter distribution through which they pass. And this leads to a net remapping of the CMB sky that we sort of see today in our experiments. And in a simulation, I can kind of show you the size of the effect. So what's shown here is a 10 by 10 degree cutout of a CMB sky simulation. So this is just a small square on this cutout from the sky. Here, the lensing has been switched off, but I can show you what happens to the CMB temperature fluctuations when I switch the lensing effect on. All right, so prepare yourself for this enormously impressive effect. Lensing is being switched on now. And hopefully you see the difference between these two images. Yeah, it's not the world's most visually striking effect, but hopefully you'll notice that the CMB hot and cold spots are moved around by just a few arc minutes, although coherently moved, in degree scale patches. All right, so because this effect is kind of hard to see and it's not visually all that impressive, if I show the real effect, I like to show a really, really exaggerated cartoon version of it, where I put an exaggerated blob of dark matter in front of the sort of background CMB, and you can see what happens, right? As you expect, the light gets bent around, lensed around this blob of dark matter, and the lensing imprints this characteristic magnification and shearing pattern into the CMB fluctuation. So this is kind of the exaggerated signature of gravitational lensing in the CMB. Okay, so that's kind of the cartoon version of the effect. Let's now describe this a bit more quantitatively. We can describe this quantitatively with an observable, the lensing potential phi. And this lensing potential phi is useful because the gradient of phi, grad phi, describes the remapping of the CMB photons on the sky. It's basically a vector field that points from the direction in which a photon is emitted to the direction in which it's received. Okay, so this grad phi or phi describes the lensing field. Now, I said that the lensing potential phi is an observable, but how can we actually observe this lensing potential? So let me first say what we actually do, and I'll try to then give an intuitive explanation of how it works. So what we actually do to measure the lensing field, the lensing potential phi, is we run what's called a quadratic estimator. Basically, we look at a sum over different pairs of modes, because these pairs of modes are correlated pretty much uniquely by lensing. And so this gives us an estimate for the lensing potential, just performing this integral over the sort of harmonic transform of the CMB sky. Okay, but that's not all that intuitive. What is this actually doing? Well, a nice sort of intuitive explanation is that this is a way of measuring a position-dependent power spectrum, right? Where lensing breaks the isotropy of the power spectrum on the sky. In other words, you can imagine this estimator locally measuring the CMB power spectrum in a little chunk of sky. And the estimator can tell whether the local CMB has been magnified and lensed or not, because if it's been magnified, then the local CMB power spectrum will be shifted to larger angular scales than average. Okay, so by locally measuring the power spectrum, you can determine whether the local CMB has been lensed or has been magnified or demagnified. And so in this way, you can go from a map of the CMB temperature and polarization to a map of the gravitational lensing. Right, and this is how we make lensing maps like this extremely early one and very bad one back from 2011. Are there any questions so far? All right, if not, let me continue. Obviously, the maps are the fundamental object, and they're really interesting because if I've measured a lensing map, I've directly and gravitationally probed.
I had a question. I mean, in the previous slide, when you gave this magnification, there's also a shear, right? So,
Yeah.
Which is not so intuitive in terms of power spectrum, right?
Yeah, so right. So this is a kind of a simplified explanation, but actually I think you can understand the shearing as well in terms of the power spectrum, right? If I think about, at least if I think about a flat sky approximation power spectrum, right, where I have basically Kx and Ky, or Lx and Ly, then the power spectrum is like it's sort of a series of rings, right? So I have a circle in harmonic space, and that's my power spectrum. Just like in galaxy lensing, I have a disk. And so the magnification stretches the power spectrum out, but the shearing you can measure in the same way because the power spectrum is sheared, right, compared to the average. So you have an ellipse for your power spectrum. So I think you're right that actually 50% of our information comes from this shearing and not just the magnification, but it's the same modulation of the power spectrum effect, I think, that you can, that you get. Right. And this explanation only works on very large scales, so it's a little bit hand wavy, as you know. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks for that. Very good point. Okay. So we'd like to take this lensing map. We want to do quantitative cosmology with it. So of course, we all know that what you need to do is you need to measure a power spectrum, right? And this The power spectrum of this CMB lensing map is the lensing power spectrum CL55, which tells you, how strong is the lensing as a function of the angular scale of the lens, right? So how strong is the lensing as a function of the multiple, as a function of the extent of the lens. Now, this is a theory curve for this lensing power spectrum. It's very easy to understand the shape of this curve, because as I told you, if the lensing probes the projected mass, then the lensing power spectrum, you can understand, probes the projected matter power spectrum. And so the lensing power spectrum inherits this sort of peaked structure just from the projected matter power spectrum. For CMB lensing, this lensing power spectrum is primarily sensitive to higher redshifts. It picks up a broad range of redshifts in this kind of projection kernel, but mostly you're getting contributions from around redshift 2, 1, 2, 3, but with a peak around redshift 2. And also, you're mostly getting signal from quite large linear or near linear scales. Now, as you expect, this translates to constraining power on parameters like sigma 8, right? The clumpiness of the universe. And indeed, that's a parameter we constrain really well with lensing. There's also some dependence on the matter density and the Hubble constant, but the primary thing that CMB lensing constrains is this combination sigma 8 omega matter over 0.3 to the power 0.25. The exponent here is a little different than from galaxy lensing because it's coming from higher redshifts. So, the intuition here is that for the same amount of lensing, I can trade off clumpiness of the universe and the amount of matter. And this is a typical sort of constraint banana that you get from a CMB lensing measure. Of course, these measurements can also constrain any kind of other physics that affect the growth of structure, for example, the neutrino mass, and et cetera. But I won't go into that in so much detail. I'm going to focus more on what CMB lensing can tell us about these general questions about the growth of cosmic structure and the S8 tension. So, you might wonder, looking at this plot with all these different measurements, like, why do I need to add another one? But I think adding CMB lensing does have a lot of value because it's, very much independent from everything on this plot, right? So, especially our ACT lensing measurements are independent of Planck on the one hand, but obviously they're also independent of all the galaxy surveys in terms of, systematics that you might worry about. So it's an independent probe. I'll also present measurements that are as precise as anything else on here. And finally, it's worth bearing in mind that, even though all of these probes, we always map them to, one S8 or one sigma 8 parameter, they're really probing the growth of structure on different scales and on different redshifts, right? So they're not all measuring the same thing. And I can sort of illustrate this in a cartoon manner with this plot of sort of redshift and scale or wave number that different experiments probe. And so they're all nicely complementary in some sense. So what CMB lensing tells you is it probes the growth of structure at high redshifts around 2 and on large scales. And it's very much complementary to other probes which access different regimes. And this is important if you take these tensions as a sign that lambda CDM is breaking down and there's some new physics operating, because any kind of new physics, you would expect to have some characteristic scale or redshift dependence that you would want to confirm and you would want to use to learn more about what's going on. Okay, so hopefully this has motivated why we'd like to measure CMB lensing to learn about the growth of structure. Let me turn now, unless there are any questions, I will turn now to our actual measurements and our actual results.
What are the arrows showing there? I mean, in the previous plot again?
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to illustrate that there's lots of useful comparisons that you can make between measurements at different scales and redshift. So, you can compare, generally what's done is you compare the amplitude of structure from the primary CMB to what you measure at low redshifts, right? So that's the sort of standard comparison. There's also an interesting thing you can do where you compare galaxy lensing structure measurements with CMB lensing. Anyway, that's where I was going with this. Okay, right, let me now turn to our measurements. and their implications, right? So here is a picture of the Atacama telescope. Let me show a nice video showing the telescope. Now, for years, I've been going around saying ACT is a 6-meter ground-based CMB telescope located high up in the Atacama Desert with arrays of sensitive TS bolometers. I can't say that now because it's a former telescope. So ACT was a 6-meter telescope. Last year, ACT was sort of dismantled and taken off the mountain because the team were all just focusing on Simon's Observatory, which has just started observing. But the good news for ACT is, there's a huge amount of data on disk that I think is really state of the art and that we're, working now very hard to finish analyzing. So the ACT collaboration lives on, and there's at least, 1 or 2 more sort of data releases or major products that are coming out. Now, what I'll talk about today is what I think is a really exciting, part of a really exciting CMB data set, namely the ACT Data Release 6 data set. And the CMB maps from DR6, I think, are really a big step forward for ACT and maybe generally for ground-based CMB. So for the purposes of lensing, they really have everything going for them. They're large sky, covering 16,000 square degrees with tons of overlap with different surveys. They're polarization sensitive, they're high resolution, arc-minute resolution, and they're also very low noise. So, in short, if you compare data release 6 versus the previous cosmology release, data release 4, data release 6 has 10 times more data volume. So it's a big step forward. And it's great for lensing. So without further ado, let me just show you the CMB lensing mass map that my group and our collaborators in ACT made from this CMB map using our curved sky lensing reconstruction pipeline that's based on a quadratic estimator. So here's our ACT DR6 CMB lensing mass map. Now, what's shown here is the gravitational lensing convergence, which is directly proportional to the density of mass. So that's what this color scale tells you. Strength of lensing or density of mass and dark matter in projection. This map covers around a quarter of the sky. So it's quite large sky, at least compared to galaxy lensing images. And it's been filtered so that these are all real structures, right? So the Wiener filter has been applied to isolate signal-dominated scales. So, all of these blobs are real, clumps of projected mass at, at high redshifts. This is, it's pretty cool that we're now able to map the mass distribution over such a large fraction of the universe, I personally think. This is a nice step forward in fidelity. It has roughly 2 times the signal to noise per mode if I compare it with the sort of very latest Planck analysis. Although it is a somewhat smaller area as well. All right, let me now just show off this map a little bit more because I like it so much. I'm going to zoom in on this sort of small 900 square degree cutout of the map. Here what I'm showing is the lensing potential. But basically, this is just a map, again, of the projected mass and dark matter with a suitable filtering. And again, you can see the projected blobs of mass and dark matter in this image. Now, it's easy for me to claim, I'm sure it's easy for me to claim that these are real structures of mass, but if you're skeptical, you say, how do I know that these are real large-scale structures in the universe? So one nice trick that we can play is that we can compare this lensing dark matter map with a map of the galaxy distribution at similar redshifts. And given that galaxies trace the underlying dark matter, those images should look similar if indeed we're mapping the real large-scale structure with our CMB lensing reconstruction. Okay, so we actually have a very nice galaxy image, which comes from the cosmic infrared background. It basically tells you how much light is coming from dusty star-forming galaxies at redshift 2, which is very similar to the CMB lensing kernel. So if everything's working, the cosmic infrared background image should look similar to the CMB lensing dark matter image. So let me just show that by overplotting contours of cosmic infrared background. So here you can see the contours showing the strength of the cosmic infrared background emission, basically how much light is coming from dusty galaxies. And hopefully you'll agree that there's a nice correspondence between the density of matter and the amount of light you're receiving from the cosmic infrared background. Now, I don't think anyone would find this surprising, but we all know that, luminous objects trace the underlying dark matter distribution, but I think it's cool to just see this illustrated so nicely and visually.
So Blake,
Okay.
the cosmic infrared background is data from Planck, or is it okay? This is the CMB.
Yeah, this is the Planck 545 gigahertz cosmic infrared background. Actually, the GNIL cosmic infrared background image, which mostly comes from 545 gigahertz. Okay, so this is our lensing map. That's really the sort of fundamental object that we make. But of course, if we want to move on and get cosmological parameters, so we need to measure our lensing power spectrum. And I should emphasize that a lot of the hard work here on getting this very precise lensing spectrum was done by my former student, Frank Chu, so who really did heroic work here. And I'm not just saying nice things about him because he bought my, at the time, new baby, an ACT lensing map t-shirt, but it definitely helps his case. Okay, so we have a lensing map, and we want to measure a lensing power spectrum. It's not quite as simple as just squaring the lensing map that we measure, because there's a noise bias that we need to subtract, which is sort of this red line. You can understand the origin of this noise bias if you remember that the lensing comes from a quadratic estimator. And if I square that, then I get a 4-point correlation function in the CMB temperature. And even without any lensing or any non-Gaussianity, that's going to be non-zero. So I need to subtract off this kind of noise bias. But this is something that we've known how to do for a long time. Our pipelines have nice algorithms to do this robustly. That's not so hard. What is hard is, given that we're pushing to sort of couple of % precision for the first time from the ground, is to really make sure that you absolutely trust your results at this level of precision. The good news, though, is that the ACT DR6 data set has a huge amount of redundancy that allows us to do null tests to gain confidence in our results in a blind analysis framework. So, for example, you can do tests checking that you get consistent lensing at different frequencies, in temperature versus polarization, on different scales, in different sky regions with different telescope arrays, and so on and so on. In fact, Frank ran more than 200 null tests to check that we have consistent results. At first, though, I have to say that this null test suite did not pass. There were significant issues that we had to overcome for everything to look good. And so there were two main challenges in this data analysis. The first challenge was kind of the noise challenge, and the second challenge was the foreground challenge. Let me just talk about these two main challenges briefly. So the story of this noise challenge, the first issue, is that we started by running the simplest null test we could imagine, which is I just take a map with noise, only noise, that I get from the data by differencing seasons, for example. So I have a noise map, I run it through my pipeline, I better get 0. But instead of getting 0, this null test gave us these horrible green points, which were not at all 0. So even the noise was producing a false signal. So what was going on here? We realized after some investigation that the issue was that this ground-based noise was so complicated because of the atmosphere, because of this complex scan pattern, that our procedures for removing the noise bias were just breaking down, right? They relied to some extent on simulations, but the simulations that we had of the noise were just not really good enough for this step of the algorithm. So how did we solve this problem? Well, basically, we decided to come up with a new way of measuring the lensing power spectrum that only used cross correlations between different parts of the data. So if you have a 4-point correlation function, you split your data in different parts, and you never repeat the same chunk of data in the 4-point function. And this means that you have no bias from instrument and atmospheric noise. And therefore, you don't rely on these simulations so heavily. So this sort of cross-correlation-based method for measuring the lensing spectrum solved this problem. And if you run it with the new cross-based estimator, you get everything looks fine, and you get these blue points which pass the test. So that was the noise challenge. A second major challenge that we faced was the challenge of extragalactic foregrounds. Now, what I mean by that is that the CMB on its path to us is not just gravitationally lensed, but it's also scattered by SC clusters, and it's also joined by emission from dusty galaxies, such as the cosmic infrared, the cosmic infrared background image I showed you earlier. And the bright ones you can even see in a CMB map at high resolution. Now, these foregrounds can also produce a 4-point function, just like the real lensing, and can therefore bias the lensing signal at a few percent level. This used to be negligible, but now the precision's high enough that we have to worry about this. Again, the good news, though, is that it's fairly straightforward to mitigate these sort of few percent foreground biases. So we have two alternative mitigation schemes that we implemented in our pipeline. The first alternative is what I would call a geometric mitigation scheme. Basically, we modify this lensing quadratic estimator so that it doesn't respond to Poisson distributed sources, which is mostly what the foregrounds look like. The alternative method that we cross-checked our baseline geometric method with is a frequency-based method where we use data at different frequencies to kind of remove the foregrounds, which don't have a black body frequency distribution. And so in simulations, we found that, in 4 different simulations, we found that the biases, no matter what our scale cut was, were very much negligible. Some of the biases were a fraction of a sigma. But also, we didn't just rely on simulations. We also did lots of null tests, in particular, comparing different frequencies. And we found good consistency between both of these approaches to mitigating foregrounds. And our conclusion was that foreground biases were under control. All right, so, having addressed the 2 major challenges of noise and foregrounds, the null test suite now, finally, at the end of our work, looked really good, and it passed. And I'm just showing a subset of the null tests we ran. What's shown here is the consistency of the lens, the overall amplitude of the lensing power spectrum, A lens, and you find that you get consistent lensing at different times. You get consistent lensing in temperature versus polarization with different foreground cleaning methods at different frequencies and different parts of the sky on different scales, and so on and so on. So this, suite of null tests really gave us confidence that we should believe our lensing power spectrum results. All right, and so with that, we were ready to unblind and look at what our results meant for cosmology. Are there any questions so far? Okay. So this is the prediction for the lensing power spectrum, right? What you can see in this black line is what you expect based just on a fit early time CMB anisotropies, assuming lambda CDM structure growth. But before we unblinded, we were not allowed to compare our lensing power spectrum measurements to this theoretical curve. But, since our null test suite passed, we agreed that we were happy to unblind, and we went on a Zoom call, and, Frank pressed a button. It was all very nerve-wracking. And for the first time, we overplotted our measurements on top of this theory curve. And so let me just overplot our results. So our measurements, overplotted here, are shown in red, and you can compare them with this black theoretical curve. The main analysis region we use is this sort of the region that's not shaded. We exclude some of the other ones to be conservative, although it's not all that important. So the main thing, hopefully, you'll agree on is that these measurements are in good agreement with the lambda CDM theory prediction, right? And the agreement, if you look at an amplitude, is around the 2% level in precision. So the fact that this agrees and has a good chi-squared is really a huge success for lambda CDM. I want to emphasize that this black curve is not a fit to this red data set. This is a prediction, right, based on a totally different experiment. And so a lot has to go right for this to work, right? You have to correctly predict, how structure grows, how it lenses the CMB. You measure it with a totally different experiment, and it agrees at 2% level. It's an impressive success for lambda CDM, in my opinion. All right, let's turn, though, to the cosmological parameters that we get from this and from our lensing power spectrum likelihood. So, as I explained to you earlier, when you look at what lensing power spectra constrain, they constrain this sort of this degeneracy banana between sigma and omega matter. The best constrained parameter is sigma omega matter of 0.3 to the power of 0.25, which we call S8 CMB lens. And our result is that S8 CMB lens is 0.818 plus or minus 0.02. So a precise measurement. And if you compare that with the early time Planck CMB predictions, based on lambda CDM structure growth, you find this red contour, which is in great agreement with what we actually measure directly at late times. So it's not low, but our measurements are not low. You can make these CMB lensing S8 determinations even more precise if you combine the two most precise CMB lensing measurements that are out there right now. The ACT CMB lensing one, which is just a tiny bit more precise, but the Planck lensing one is also still very good. And so you want to combine them, especially given that they have mostly independent information. You do have to include the covariance between the two, but you can fairly straightforwardly build a joint likelihood. And that's what we did, what Frank did. And the joint ACT plus Planck CMB lensing constraints are shown here in red, giving you sort of 2.2% constraint from CMB lensing from one observable on its own, 0.813 plus or minus 0.018. Again, in great agreement with the early time CMB predictions from Planck, which are shown here in black. Now, we can make these measurements even more precise if we combine CMB lensing alone with baryon acoustic oscillation data. And the motivation for doing this is that CMB lensing alone probes, as I said, a combination of sigma 8 and omega matter, and adding baryon acoustic oscillation data pins down omega m. And you can see that here, it works surprisingly well for reasons that I'm happy to discuss in more detail. So if you look at our ACT plus Planck CMB lensing only constraint, that's this transparent red contour here. If I add the BOSS BAO data, I get this solid red contour here, showing our sort of maybe headline result, our direct measurement, and giving you sigma 8 of 0.812 plus or minus 0.013. So this is probably our main result, a 1.6% measurement of this quantity, which I also really do believe. I think this is, I have a lot of confidence in this. Again, you can compare with the prediction based on Planck CMB power spectra based on lambda CDM structure growth, and that's shown here in black. And so you find very good agreement, right? So our CMB lensing is not low. And I think this has important implications, right? If you want to come up with a new physics explanation for the S8 tension, or you're proposing some other new physics, you need to take this constraint into account. Any new physics that significantly messes up structure growth at high redshifts and large scales would be disfavored by this high precision agreement. Okay, let me just, for completeness, compare our measurement with cosmic shear. Our direct measurement is shown here in red, and when we combine with BAO, and here you can see different cosmic shear measurements analyzed in the same way, also including BAO. I'm happy to discuss why our constraint looks pretty good. We benefit a lot more from BAO than other forms of weak lensing. It's kind of interesting. But I think the comparison tells you that shear seems to be lower, but sort of consistent at the 2 sigma level. Here's the big picture for S8 now, adding R points to this curve and noting that S8 is not necessarily the best parameter that we constrain. So CMB lensing, though, from high redshifts and large scales is consistent with the early universe lambda CDM prediction. On the other hand, it seems like probes that depend on smaller scales or lower redshifts seem to be coming in a bit lower, although at moderate significance. So that's kind of an interesting scenario. And I'll say more about this later when I talk about cross correlations. Let me just, as a bit of an aside for this talk, although it's also, I think, very interesting, talk about the other cosmological parameters that we get from from our CMB lensing power spectrum, right? We can't just measure S8, of course. We can also constrain the neutrino masses because they suppress the power spectrum and therefore the lensing power spectrum. So here are shown the neutrino mass constraints from ACT lensing and different data combinations. Maybe the headline result is the combined ACT plus Planck one shown here in red. And this is with BOSS BAO. So what we get then is a constraint of less than 0.12 electron volts. So this is, as good as anything else that was out there at the time of publication. Our lensing measurements were also included in the sort of DESI-BAO derived neutrino mass constraint, which is very tight, giving you a bound of less than 0.07 eV at 95% confidence level. Actually, maybe surprisingly tight, potentially due to the way the DESI data fluctuated. So I'll be interested to see what happens to the next DESI release, which should be coming out, I think, in order a year. But so this is a very nice constraint on the neutrino mass. Okay, so those are the neutrino mass constraints. I also want to briefly mention a constraint on the Hubble constant that we derive from our CMB lensing data set. And this constraint is physically quite different, I would argue, from other CMB and large-scale structure constraints. So the story here is that normally when you measure the Hubble constant from CMB or from BAO, you're relying on a standard ruler, which is the sound horizon scale. But some people, to explain the Hubble tension, have proposed that maybe the sound horizon scale is messed up by some early universe new physics. So it's interesting to think about if there's another scale you could use to measure the Hubble constant with. And in fact, we have another scale, which we can see very clearly in our CMB lensing power spectrum, which is the scale of matter radiation equality. Sets the peak of this lensing power spectrum. So from that different scale, we get a physically very different measurement of the Hubble constant, which has a bigger error, but I think that it's very much complementary because it's very different. And despite being so physically different, it comes in quite low, 65 plus or minus 3. So maybe that makes it a little harder to think about early universe explanations because they have to mess up both of these scales in a similar way. All right, let me return, though, to the main kind of thread of my talk, which is testing structure growth with CMB lensing. And in particular, let me talk briefly about what we can learn from cross correlations. So I've already said that our CMB lensing power spectra from high redshifts and large scales seem to be fully consistent with lambda CDM and Planck. And so the question is, given that other probes from different regimes seem to be reporting low values, can we investigate these other regimes a little bit further to see if something interesting is going on there? And so what we can do with cross correlations is kind of test this low redshift, large scale regime further. In particular, what we can do to get our CMB lensing constraints on structure growth down to lower redshifts is we can cross correlate with galaxy surveys from low redshift. So the idea here is that galaxy surveys, on their own, at least in projection, can't really tell the difference between sigma 8 and galaxy bias. But if you add a cross correlation of CMB lensing with galaxies, then you can break that degeneracy and you can probe sigma 8 at the galaxy redshift. So you can then probe sigma 8 versus redshift down to low Z, much lower than redshift 2. There are lots of samples we can correlate our ACT lensing map with, not just galaxies, but also quasars, et cetera, because we have a ton of overlap with optical surveys. I want to focus, though, on an analysis that was published in the fall last year, led by my student Garrett Farren, which is a correlation of ACT lensing with the unWISE galaxy sample. So unWISE galaxies are measured by the WISE satellite at a few micron wavelengths. unWISE is a sort of an expansion of the WISE program. It uses data taken for longer. And reanalyzes it to make a nice uniform catalog. The nice thing about unWISE is that you have 150 million galaxies, huge number density, huge number of galaxies over a large area. This unWISE galaxy sample can be divided into two redshift samples, one blue sample coming mostly from redshift 0.6, and a green sample coming mostly from redshift 1.1. And we can take these two different redshift samples, the blue and the green unWISE galaxy samples, and we can cross-correlate them with our ACT lensing map. And hopefully, we should see a cross-correlation. And you see a huge cross-correlation. So here are the cross spectra of ACT lensing with the two different unWISE galaxy samples. Here's the blue sample cross spectrum, CL5G, and here's the green sample cross spectrum. And the main takeaway here is, as someone who remembers when these cross correlations were like 3 or 4 sigma and we were really excited about it, it's really nice to see that this is now a signal to noise of greater than 80. So it's whopping signal to noise. And the challenge then becomes modeling and systematics. All right. So I should emphasize that this is not the first time that a CMB lensing map was correlated with this unWISE galaxy sample. This was done with the Planck lensing map. And they actually found a low assay, intriguingly. But we've made lots of improvements in the process of doing this new ACT analysis. Actually, a lot of the people from this team joined our analysis. And it turns out that some of these changes and some of these fixes cause these results to change a little bit. All right. So what are some of the improvements that we made aside from kind of bug fixes? The first improvement is that we have better redshifts. We have better data from EBOS at the higher redshift end to characterize the redshift distributions. They come from cross correlations with spectroscopic data, primarily. We also have a better accounting for the errors. And finally, the modeling now includes a proper marginalization over all the higher order galaxy biases, which were fixed to their fiducial values previously. So another thing that I think we did more work on than this previous analysis is we did lots more tests, lots more null tests, in particular focusing on angular clustering systematics. So it's very confidence inspiring that we get the same cosmology sort of no matter where we look in the sky, right? If you're worried about galactic issues or things like that. Okay, so with that, we're ready to unblind. I'm just going to go quite quickly and show you our results. So here's the result for S8. You can compare in gray the prediction based on early time lambda CDM expectations from Planck CMB. And in black is our headline combined lensing cross-correlation result, which comes from ACT lensing and Planck lensing together. And so what we get is a value of S8 is 0.81 plus or minus 0.015. And this, though, is coming not from redshift 2, but it's coming from from a low redshift rate, redshift 0.6, 1.1, that kind of redshifts. All right, so it's a little bit low, but it's very much in agreement at the sort of 1 sigma level with what you predict from Planck. The agreement is even more striking if you look at sigma 8 and after adding BAO. Then you see the prediction here in gray, and you can compare with the combined unWISE cross ACT and Planck result in black, and what you find is very, very good agreement. So we get sigma 8 as 0.813 plus or minus 0.015. So these are really state-of-the-art constraints on structure growth, but now coming from somewhat lower redshifts. So the key point is that even these lower redshift results are also completely consistent with predictions from lambda CDM, at least on large scale. So that's interesting for this big picture. As an aside, we're not done with unWISE yet. There's a combined autospectrum cross-correlation analysis coming out soon. We've made measurements of the bispectrum, which we think are really cool and that could help us with the modeling to break bias degeneracy. So a lot more is coming with unWISE. But let me now just stop and summarize our main conclusions for structure growth from ACT lensing. So, if I had to show one plot kind of summarizing the results I discussed in this talk, it would be this one. So what's plotted here is sigma 8 as a function of redshift on the top here, divided by the fiducial, Planck lambda CDM expectation for sigma 8 of C. And so if everything follows standard lambda CDM predicted structure growth, then you should get a value of 1 everywhere over all redshifts. Now we have 3 different ACT observables at different redshifts. We have the lensing power spectrum, And there are 3 points: ACT alone, Planck, lensing, and the combination. So that's lensing power spectra. And then we also have the unWISE green sample cross correlations at redshift 1.1 and the unWISE blue sample cross correlations at redshift 0.6. And so generally, from this picture at least, it really seems that structure growth follows the lambda CDM prediction over time at quite high, couple of % precision. So that's sort of, I would say, the main takeaway from our analyses. Now, does that mean that everyone else has got it wrong? That's not what we're saying at all, right? All we're saying is that kind of in the sort of large scale regime, over the redshift range we probe, from 0.6 and upwards, lambda CDM seems fine, at least from these measurements. We can't say anything about what's going on at, either very, very low redshifts or on very small scales. And so an interesting question is that, if there's some new physics in this regime that's driving some of these tensions. And this is not totally implausible, right? I think an interesting possibility is that the S8 tension could be a scale-dependent effect, right? Maybe you have a real small-scale suppression of structure due to either astrophysics, very extreme feedback, which is moving the matter around, or, most interestingly, due to new physics, like some more interesting dark matter models. So this could explain all the results together, potentially, including the galaxy lensing results. And this was pointed out by some colleagues like Alex Amon and George Efstathiou, this possibility. So I think a lot more work is needed to investigate this possibility. I think we will hopefully find out more in the next few years of whether systematics or fluctuations are to blame, or whether maybe there is some real new physics that's suppressing structure growth, at least on small scales. All right, so with that, I will wrap up and leave you with my summary. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Blake. I have a question. So do you use polarization information at all, or I didn't quite catch that?
Yes, so we use the minimum variance combination of temperature, ACT temperature, and polarization to do the lensing construction. We still get most of our information from temperature, but it's the balance is getting much closer than it was for Planck. So I think our total signal to noise is about 43. And if I recall correctly, our polarization only signal to noise for lensing is almost 20. So we do get a fair bit of polarization.
So it's fairly comparable now.
Yeah, it's almost equal information of temperature and polarization. Not quite. Getting there.
Okay. Question from the audience. Yes.
Can I ask a nice question, Ravi? So, when you show this cross plot where you get sigma from different scales and
Yeah.
I was just trying to understand, how do we say that the galaxy lensing is giving us large scale measurement of small scale measurement of S8, and the CMB lensing is large scale measurement of S8?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a bit of a cartoon, right? And I think other people have made more, potentially more rigorous and fancier versions of this plot. I mean, actually, for example, these lines shouldn't be straight because they're L's, and okay. But basically, all you have to do is you think about the spectra that you measure and the redshifts you measure, and galaxy lensing is generally lower redshifts, and they're not particularly good at measuring very low L's. And so if you look at the range, the range of scales that they measure in their sort of CL kappa kappa or CL phi phi or gamma gamma plots, and you turn that in and you say, like, what range of Ks does that correspond to, then you find something like this. So from kind of mildly nonlinear scales to around K of 1. The projection causes quite high Ks and quite small scales to kind of enter into the mix for galaxy lensing. Although obviously they also apply scale cuts, so they can adjust exactly the range of scales they get, but generally, yeah, based on the observables they measure and the redshifts they measure and the signal to noise they have, this is, I think, an approximate version of their sensitivity. Did that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And one more question, I think it was from very early part of your slide. You were showing that noise bias in your phi estimator, and it was coming non-zero when you were taking like full sky, and then you took like robust estimator where you take like cuts of sky, then do cross correlation.
Yeah. This plot, you
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, this one. Yeah, exactly. So I was just trying to understand. So if you take this cross correlation between different paths, should it give you more noise in the estimation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to clarify, we're taking cross correlations not between different parts of the sky, but we're taking cross correlations here in this 4-point function. So between data taken at different times. So you could imagine this as like T1 is like a CMB map made only from the first year of observations. T2 is from the second year of observations. T3 is from the third year, etc. It's not quite so simple, but that's the general idea. And so because of that, the noise in the first year is completely independent from the noise in the second year and so on. And so in this 4-point function, that's why the noise bias is 0. Okay, but back to your question. So yes, you get a signal to noise hit because effectively you're throwing away T1, 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 and T2,
Exactly.
T2, T2.
Exactly.
Now, for our case, like we estimated how much we lose, and it was around 10%. Like the hit wasn't very big. And part of the reason that was the case is that, in temperature, where we still get most of our information, we're signal dominated, actually. So increasing the noise a little bit doesn't actually matter very much for the overall lensing signal to noise, right? Like at temperature, we measure so well that it doesn't matter if we, we're limited much more by foregrounds than we are by actual instrument noise. So it doesn't matter for that purpose. For polarization, the hit is a little bigger. And we are actually thinking about whether we can increase the number of these splits, right? So basically, the amount you lose in signal to noise depends on how many divisions of your data you have. If I have infinite divisions of my data, then I'm only throwing away the diagonal, and that's as the divisions become very large, the fraction that I'm losing goes to 0. So we're trying to we're thinking about whether we can go to 8 splits in the next analysis, but that's unclear. So basically, the loss is moderate, 10%.
So if you take like more cuts, then is it like computationally more costly, or why?
It is, yeah. So that's another factor, right? So there's the more splits you have, the more of these 4-point functions you have to compute, and so your computational cost goes up.
Makes sense.
And there's also another challenge, which is like, if you keep subdividing, at some point you need each pixel to be covered many times, right? And if you keep chunking up your data, at some point, you reach a point where you can't divide it anymore, and so that's another limitation. There is a very fast algorithm that I think is actually the main result of this paper that allows this to be done in a tractable amount of time. But still, as you said, more splits, more time.
I have one question. What is the signal to noise ratio of this ACT lensing mass map that you showed?
Yeah, so the total FNR on our lensing measurement, sorry, it sort of depends on what you mean. So the total signal to noise on the lensing power spectrum is 43. If you're thinking about like the per mode SNR on these structures, is that what you mean?
Or in the map level, like in the Planck,
Yeah.
it's 1 sigma level.
Yeah, right. So I think here it's around 3 or 2 or 3.
And
So
what
it's not enormously signal dominated, but these are still real structures.
And what is the correlation expected for a CIB map? Because we are working on extracting CIB map from the Planck. So suppose I
Yep.
correlate CIB with the lensing map. So what is the correlation you expect? Because you should roots, but
Yeah. So as I said earlier, so this is the GNIL CIB map. I believe that the correlation coefficient is not as high as you could get in a more idealized case. I think it's around 50%, maybe 60% at just the right scales.
okay.
Obviously, if you didn't have the complications of galactic dust, then it could be much higher, right? 70, 80%. But yeah, this is like 50, 60, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
So is it possible to get the asset from the CIB CMB lensing correlation, or is there any value for that?
That's a good question. I think it's hard, right? I mean, in principle, the correlation, you can imagine just doing a cross correlation of these two fields, and we have done this. It hasn't been published, but it's enormous, right? I think it's the SNR, instead of being 80, is like 150. It's an extremely precise cross spectrum. The problem is that we don't really understand what's in the CIB all that well, right? It comes from a very wide range of redshifts. You have to understand like what galaxies are contributing, how they're emitting, if you want to connect what you measure to the actual cosmology. And I think that's the challenge. So, you know, I think it's hard. Even though if you had a perfect model, you have a perfect understanding of, you know, the CIB astrophysics, then you would get incredible sigma 8. But we are, I think, a long way from that, and probably we'll learn from these cross spectra more about the properties of the CIB than about cosmology for now. With maybe one exception is that you can use these cross spectra to get kind of interesting constraints on FNL from scale dependent bias, because that's quite distinctive, and you can tell apart from astrophysics, I would argue. Yeah, maybe I'm being too pessimistic. It would be really cool if you could get sigma 8 from CIB, but I think right now it still seems very hard to me.
So, Blake, would you like to comment on, so you said there's a possibility of a cosmology explanation for the values that you get at low redshifts versus high redshifts for S8. But then there are these, you said systematic possibilities. Now, would you like to compare how much of the systematic issues plague the galaxy lensing versus CMB lensing, or?
Well, I have to be careful what I say. I'm obviously very biased because I like CMB lensing and I think it's great. I would say the one, yeah, I think that I mean, CMB lensing has bad aspects and good aspects. And I think one of the good aspects is I do think it's quite clean, right? I think we do really understand the CMB really well. We don't have to worry about, you know, photometric redshift uncertainties. We don't have to worry about shear calibration problems to the same extent. We have to worry a bit about foregrounds, but, you know, even if you do nothing, there are a couple of percent, and we can quite, I think, mitigate them with some simple methods. So I think it's quite reliable. Obviously, the downside is we just have one redshift slice, right? And the signal to noise is lower. Well, at least on small scales. I think galaxy lensing is just sort of a harder challenge, right?
Yeah, I mean, no, I just, I agree, it's very difficult to comment on this, but one of the challenges I understood from galaxy lensing is the variation of PSF and stuff like that, right? Are these under control now from the latest results? I mean, I'm going back to a long time back when these were really almost limiting the returns from galaxy lensing.
Sorry, you said the PSF variation, right? Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Yeah, my sense is that is, well, from chatting with people who are in Galaxy, my sense is that is under control for them.
Yes.
So you're asking about galaxy lensing, not CMB lensing for PSF.
Yeah, I'm asking about galaxy lensing because that was, in my days, one of the promising things coming up, which didn't really deliver because of this was almost like a roadblock. I'm talking about late 90s.
Yeah, my sense is that is like to some extent been controlled both by better PSF modeling, but also there's like better ways of measuring shear, like these meta calibration approaches, which are very clever. I think the worries are more on other aspects, is my sense. I mean, redshift uncertainty always has been the big problem. There's been a lot of progress, I think, made there. So it's not necessarily clear that that's still the biggest problem, although there are other, but I think redshifts and maybe intrinsic alignments and baryons are probably the things that people now worry about the most. And they're all really hard problems. Yeah, we will also have more data on a lot of these things. Like we'll know more about baryons from not just lensing, but also like TSC, KSC. So I think there's hope that we'll just understand a lot of these things a lot better, and then going forward it'll be fine. But yeah, it is hard, and so I don't know.
And Stuhin, I can ask another question, or
Sure.
okay? So I mean, these error bars you have are very impressive on SAT, but so with better polarization measurement, how much better can you get? I mean, in principle, how much of the thing are we missing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can talk maybe about realistic surveys. In principle, I could have anything, right? But so, for example, for Simon's Observatory, well, okay. If I just talk about signal to noise on our spectrum, which sort of translates into errors on sigma 8, although there's some other limiting factors that maybe we can come back to. So, this signal to noise is about 43 on our lensing spectrum. We're hoping before we move on to Simon's Observatory to publish one more ACT lensing power spectrum where we like pull out all the stops, we add a little bit, some extra data, we do better filtering, but we improve our analysis further, we use more splits as we were talking about earlier. Maybe we can get to 70, 65, something like that. So not quite a factor of 2 better, but almost. So 43 for ACT, maybe 65, 70 for next ACT. And then Simon's Observatory, the hope is that at the end we'll have a signal to noise of about 130, 150. Yeah, so long story short, I think these errors in principle can get better by a factor of 3 or 4 in the next 5 years. You might hit other limitations, though. I have to think about it. Like there's some, uncertainty on matter and NS might become more important than raw lensing power spectrum signal to noise. So maybe sigma 8 will go down by a factor of 2 or something, or 2.5 rather than 3 or 4. But yeah, that's what I would.
Would that improve the H0 measurement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you mean this one without the sound horizon, yeah?
Right. So that was quite interesting. I mean, I not really realized that you could do that.
Yeah, it's been kind of a fun program. So we've done this with lensing, and we've done it with galaxies with like BOSS clustering. And with the BOSS clustering, I think we got an error of about 2.5. Very similar results. So, but yes, we can improve this further. I think actually we have a cross correlation coming out that gets us down to more like 2 kilometers a second. And potentially you could combine that with BOSS 3D, full shape, and that could go even further. The ultimate here, though, will be to use something like, DESI or Euclid full shape, because then the errors can go below 1 kilometer a second without relying on the sound horizon information. So I think, that'll be really interesting. I think if you have such a tiny error and you have 2 very different standard rulers from the early universe, and they both give exactly the same answer, it'll be very hard to come up with some new early universe physics that would happen.
Right, that's very interesting. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, more questions? So I don't see any hand up. So thank you, Professor Blake, for a very enlightening talk on CMB lensing based on ACT results. Yeah, so thank you.
Great, thanks for all the really interesting questions.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.